A Critique of Interventionism by Ludwig von Mises. Chapter 1 Interventionism. Part 2 The Nature of Intervention. The problem with interventionism must not be confused with that of socialism. We are not dealing here with the question of whether or not socialism in any form is conceivable or realizable. We are not here seeking an answer to the question of whether human society can be built on public property in the means of production. The problem at hand is what are the consequences of government and other interventions in the private property order? Can they achieve the results they are supposed to achieve? A precise definition of the concept intervention is now in order. 1. Measures that are taken for the purpose of preserving and securing the private property order are not interventions in this sense. This is so self-evident that it should need no special emphasis, and yet it is not completely redundant, as our problem is often confused with the problem of anarchism. It is argued that if the state must protect the private property order, it follows that further government interventions should also be permissible. The anarchist who rejects any kind of state activity is said to be consistent. But he who correctly perceives the impracticability of anarchism and seeks a state organization with its apparatus of coercion in order to secure social cooperation is said to be inconsistent when he limits government to a narrow function. Obviously, this reasoning completely misses the point. We are not here discussing the question of whether or not social cooperation can do without the organization of coercion, which is the state or government. The sole point under discussion is whether there are only two conceivable possibilities of social organization with division of labor, that is, the public property order and the private property order, disregarding syndicalism, or whether there is yet a third system as assumed by interventionists, namely a private property order that is regulated through government intervention. Incidentally, we must carefully distinguish between the question of whether or not government is necessary and the question of where and how government authority is in order. The fact that social life cannot do without the government apparatus of coercion cannot be used to conclude also that restraint of conscience, book censorship, and similar measures are desirable, or that certain economic measures are necessary, useful, or merely feasible. Regulations for the preservation of competition do not at all belong to those measures preserving the private property order. It is a popular mistake to view competition between several producers of the same product as the substance of the ideal liberal economic order. In reality, the central notion of classical liberalism is private property, and not a certain misunderstood concept of free competition. It does not matter that there are many recording studios, but it does matter that the means of record production are owned privately rather than by government. This misunderstanding, together with the interpretation of freedom that is influenced by the natural rights philosophy, has led to attempts at preventing the development of large enterprises through laws against cartels and trusts. We need not here discuss the desirability of such a policy, but we should observe that nothing is less important for an understanding of the economic effects of a certain measure than its justification or rejection by some juristic theory. Jurisprudence, political science, and the scientific branch of politics cannot offer any information that could be used for a decision on the pros and cons of a certain policy. It is rather unimportant that this pro or that con corresponds to some law or constitutional document, even if it should be as venerable and famous as the Constitution of the United States of America. If human legislation proves to be ill-suited to the end in view, it must be changed. A discussion of the suitability of policy can never accept the argument that it runs counter to statute, law, or constitution. This is so obvious that it would need no mention were it not for the fact that it is forgotten time and again. German writers sought to deduce social policy from the character of the Prussian state and social royalty. In the United States, economic discussion now uses arguments that are derived from the Constitution or an interpretation of the concepts of freedom and democracy. A noteworthy theory of interventionism set forth by Professor J.R. Commons is largely built on this rationale, and has great practical significance because it represents the philosophy of the La Follette Party and the policy of the state of Wisconsin. The authority of the American Constitution is limited to the Union, but locally the ideals of democracy, liberty, and equality reign supreme and give rise, as we can observe everywhere, to the demand for abolition of private property or its limitation. All this is insignificant for our discussion and therefore does not concern us here. 2. Partial socialization of the means of production is no intervention in our sense. The concept of intervention assumes that private property is not abolished, but that it still exists in substance rather than merely in name. Nationalization of railroad constitutes no intervention, but a decree that orders an enterprise to charge lower freight rates than it otherwise would is intervention. 3. Government measures that use market means, that is, seek to influence demand and supply through changes of market factors, are not included in this concept of intervention. If government buys milk in the market in order to sell it inexpensively to destitute mothers or even to distribute it without charge, or if government subsidizes educational institutions, there is no intervention. We shall return to this question of whether the method by which government acquires the means for such actions constitutes intervention. However, the imposition of price ceilings for milk signifies intervention. Intervention is a limited order by a social authority forcing the owners of the means of production and entrepreneurs to employ their means in a different manner than they otherwise would. A limited order is an order that is no part of a socialist scheme of orders, i.e., a scheme of orders regulating all of production and distribution, thus replacing private property in the means of production with public property. Particular orders may be quite numerous, but as long as they do not aim at directing the whole economy and replacing the profit motive of individuals with obedience as the driving force of human action, they must be regarded as limited orders. By means of production we really mean all goods of higher order, including the merchants' inventories of ready goods which have not yet reached the consumers. We must distinguish between two groups of such orders. One group directly reduces or impedes economic production in the broadest sense of the word, including the location of economic goods. The other group seeks to fix prices that differ from those of the market. The former may be called restrictions of production, the latter generally known as price controls. We are calling interference with the structure of prices.